Hello, and welcome to the first edition episode, Cheryl's Legacy Liver Voice. My name is Nancy Paul, and I was a caregiver family member to my mother, Cheryl Van Buskirk-Oxshire, who died of NAFLD NASH cirrhosis with complications of HE and kidney disease, hepatorenal syndrome in July of 2015. Since then, I have been on a mission, we'll call it, to educate and tell as many people about NAFLD NASH cirrhosis and educate not only the public but the medical profession as well. I've seen that with my mother, she was misdiagnosed for many years and misdiagnosed and not diagnosed. It was just completely a wrong diagnosis. And so I felt that it was extremely important to get the word out about fatty liver disease. The NAFLD stands for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and NASH stands for non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. So that's kind of my background and the reason I'm doing this podcast. A little bit about me is when I first, my mom was first diagnosed, I wasn't really involved in any of the any support groups or anything. I just was concentrating on taking care of my mom. After she died, I realized I needed to find out more about it. I was thirsty, I guess, for information about the disease. And so I started trying to research. I had originally, when my mother was diagnosed, reached out to the American Liver Foundation, and I was sent some brochures, but there wasn't a lot out there. So after she died, I started following the professional industry, a lot of scientists, researchers, and people in the pharmaceutical industry, biotechs. So I was getting information that was factually based, and I have a little bit of a medical background as a surgical technologist, so I could get what they would give me, decipher it, and try to do my best to warn my friends on Facebook and just general, education of the people I knew. It was during this time frame that an interim CEO of a biotech actually reached out to me that I had come across through LinkedIn that asked me if I'd be interested in working in a project with him. And he wanted me to be the layperson voice, so to speak, to try and translate the technical industry information and research that they were doing. And unfortunately, that project never got off the ground, but it gave me the idea to realize that there was a need for that I wasn't the only one out there that was searching for information on NAFLD NASH, and so I kind of on my own kept researching and connecting with people and following people, and so that's kind of what I'm doing now with the Cheryl's Legacy Liver Voice. It is certainly an emerging epidemic, not just nationally, but globally. So hopefully this will help to educate some people, raise awareness, and as I said, not just the general public, but in the medical profession. I have started, since my mother passed away, I started volunteering with the American Liver Foundation, first with walks, and then I got a lot more involved doing health fairs for the American Liver Foundation, which gave me a good opportunity to interact with a lot of the public. And as I was doing that, I met a lot of people that said they were diabetes patients, and I would ask them just generally, have you ever heard of fatty liver? And they would almost always answer, no, what is that? I've never heard that. So it started going off in my head, there is a major problem here, a disconnect between the medical professionals and some of the organizations that are not telling their patients that are at high risk with diabetes. The people that are at high risk for developing NAFLD NASH are people with obesity, certain metabolic conditions, and some like autoimmune diseases, and also diabetes. Now, my mom did not have diabetes, but she did have hypothyroidism. So she was under that metabolic, genre, and she was, your typical little chubby little old 74-year-old mother that could, you lose a few pounds. So that's how she ended up with the diabetes, or with the NAFLD NASH. And by the time she was found out, if you catch NASH, there is no treatment yet, but with regulated diet and some things, you can hopefully at least arrest the condition. But by the time she found out, she was in full-blown cirrhosis. So I'm hoping to educate people and get them the education and the awareness to talk with their medical professionals and their teams before it gets to the cirrhosis point. I'm a multi-advocator, as I say. Along with the American Liver Foundation, I also hosted last June the first Indiana International NASH Day downtown on Monument Circle. And through them, I got involved with the Global Liver Institute, who is behind the International NASH Days around the world. And then I also, because of my mother developing this hepatorenal syndrome and had a need for dialysis, could not get her into a dialysis clinic. Since her death, have gotten acquainted with dialysis advocates and have spoke on their behalf at a meeting in Washington, D.C. at the Whistleblower Summit about the issues that high-risk comorbidity patients face trying to get dialysis. And so it was actually through the dialysis issue that I met my guest this evening, Cheryl Dixon. At the time, she was the director for the Indiana and Kentucky region for the American Diabetes Association. And so I had just cold called them off of a commercial I saw about their walk, wanting to warn people with diabetes that are at risk at some point needing dialysis about the issues my mother had with dialysis. Then later, as time went along, I did some television shows on behalf of the American Liver Foundation with an organization called Boomer Magazine, and it turned out that Cheryl Dixon was their health writer, and she wrote an article for me about hepatitis C, well, for Boomer, but for me and the American Liver Foundation on hepatitis C, and then also NAFLD NASH. So that leads me to my guest this evening. Like I said, I thought Cheryl Dixon would be a great guest for my first episode because the patients with diabetes are such at high risk. I call diabetes and NAFLD like kissing cousins because they're very closely related. So now I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl and let her tell you from her experience what she's seen in the diabetes world.
Thanks so much, Nancy, for having me with you tonight. You're such a passionate person when it comes to patient advocacy, and I really admire all that you're doing in that area. And this liver disease and diabetes connection is such a major health issue, and yet it's hidden, just like you mentioned. And like you said, we first met when you came to the ADA to talk about kidney dialysis patients and the serious issues they were having with not being able to have home care and not being able to have treatment because of comorbidities. And honestly, even though I worked in that realm and, obviously knew the severe complication of kidney disease with someone with diabetes, I did not know that was a problem. So you really opened my eyes to that. And it became something that when I went to health fairs or when I did presentations, I would talk to people about that, to help make them aware. So I'm really pleased that I met you and that, we can kind of carry on this mission in different ways. So, as our conversations continued, then I started learning about NASH and NAFLD, and so that brings us to tonight's conversation about diabetes and the connection with these liver diseases. But before we do that, I have to give a little presentation on what diabetes is, because it kind of ties it all together. So diabetes is when you have too much sugar or glucose in your blood, and it makes your blood real thick and syrupy. So just think of molasses syrup, and that's your blood. And it's trying to get through your vessels and your veins in your body. Well, that's very rough on your vessels and your veins in your body. And where in your body do you not have veins and vessels, right?
Right.
So diabetes literally affects every single part of your body, every organ in your body. So the complications that we most hear about with diabetes are things like blindness, early cataract formation, glaucoma, end-stage kidney disease leading to the dialysis, amputation, heart attack, and stroke. But then where is this fatty liver disease? We don't hear about that. That was not something that at the ADA we were really trained to talk about. It just didn't come up much. And yet it really should, because the diabetes raises your risk of fatty liver disease. Fatty liver disease, if you don't have diabetes, raises your risk for developing type 2 diabetes.
Exactly.
And it's kind of like this light bulb goes off and it's like, oh my goodness, right? And personally, I have type 2 diabetes. My doctor never mentioned that to me. The only mention he ever did about the liver was I was spiking some higher blood sugars in the morning, and he said, well, that's because your liver is storing the sugar and it spills out overnight. That's it. Never mentioned the fact that I could be at risk for fatty liver disease.
Now, is this a nephrologist or a general?
It was my general
primary?
practitioner. Yeah, it was my primary care doctor. I didn't have any kidney issues. Everything was fine, so I've not seen a nephrologist. Okay. But I used to host programs called Ask the Experts, and I always had a nephrologist there. Never talked about fatty liver disease. So, it's just, in fact, none of the experts, I don't recall anything about fatty liver disease ever being talked about by any of these experts. So it is important for people to know about this connection so that they can go to their doctor and say, well, hey, am I at risk for this? Are there tests that I need to have done to see where I'm at? Because it's silent. Much like type 2 diabetes can be very silent, and you cannot have it until you land up in the hospital, maybe with a stroke or heart attack, and that's when they find it. So, fatty liver disease usually doesn't cause any symptoms per se. Is that?
Yeah, usually liver disease in general, but fatty liver disease doesn't present until you have a lot of times extreme fibrosis scarring, which might be NASH stage 3, stage 4, or a lot of times not even until you've developed cirrhosis, which is a very serious condition with your liver.
Yeah.
And you're in transplant territory at that point.
Yeah. So, It just really flabbergasted me that there wasn't more talk about these two things together. So glucose or sugar is our body's fuel. We have to have it in order to live. So, if you do have diabetes, you can't just go out and say, okay, I'm going to stop eating sugar or foods that turn to sugar, all the different carbohydrates and things like that turn to sugar. But the problem is when we have too much. Now, the liver is a reservoir, and it does hold on to that sugar so that if we don't eat or our body senses that we need some, then it can spill it out and give it to us.
And in conjunction with diabetes, the main catalyst for developing fatty liver is sugar. Like corn syrups as well. Any of that is what a lot of the people, you can trace it back to. They've had it, they drink a lot of sodas, a lot of food that have a lot of sugars in it, or the corn syrups. And that is a huge primary catalyst for the fatty liver. So that's why I call diabetes and NAFLD NASH kissing cousins, because it's so much of the same problem, that sugar-based diet that is just so detrimental.
Right. So when you're not eating, especially like overnight or between meals, and the body has to make its own sugar, then, like I said, it takes it from the liver. So your best defense against fatty liver disease, like you said, there's not a treatment per se. You don't just take a pill and take care of it. It's very much the same as with trying to prevent type 2 diabetes from developing or managing your type 2 diabetes. Healthy eating, exercise, it's those things that we probably all get tired of hearing, honestly. But that's what it is.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just the realism of it. We need to take steps to reduce high blood pressure. We need to keep our LDL and bad cholesterol low. We need to keep our our HDL, our good cholesterol. It needs to be, higher. It's a balancing act, and it can be very difficult for people.
But it's an issue of choosing life or choosing fun food, or, fatty, fun, sugary food, or choosing life. And I know my mom, had she been able to do it over, would definitely have chosen life.
Absolutely. And if you do have type 2 diabetes and you want to know, your doctor might suggest doing an ultrasound on your liver. But don't wait for your doctor to say it to you. This is where I always want patients to be their advocate. Ask your doctor questions. Say, should I have this done?
Exactly.
Or I think I should have this done. Can we do this?
I kind of go farther and say demand it.
Exactly. Sometimes patients get blood work done and they don't hear back about the results, and they're like, well, I'm sure it's fine. I would have heard something if it wasn't. Don't assume that. If you're getting blood work done, know exactly what you're getting done, and then call and find out the results and ask questions. I had something very similar that just happened to me this week. I had gotten some blood work done. I saw some things that when I looked at my results online, I thought, well, those don't look quite right. So I asked the nurse practitioner, and she's like, oh, well, if everything else if the major points are okay, the major blood draw, this is related to my hemoglobin. She said, if that's okay, then they just kind of ignore those other things. And I thought, okay, yeah, well, I'll talk to the doctor about it later.
Yeah.
Today I get a call. You know what? The doctor feels like they need to do some additional blood work because you had these abnormalities. And it's like, that's what I just asked you about yesterday. So, we have to stay on top of these things. We have to educate ourselves or ask other people and not just sit there.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. You have to be your own best advocate. And even with, like you mentioned, doing a CAT scan, you said?
Ultrasound.
Ultrasound, that's it. There is not a definitive test on the fatty liver disease. The best thing to do it's called a fibroscan. I don't know that a lot of the smaller hospitals necessarily have them, but I know like in Indiana, the IU Health Liver Clinic is definitely going to have a fibroscan. But there's not an easy blood serum or blood draw test or anything. And so you have to keep asking. And I just read an article that the ALT and AST are huge in liver disease indicators for NAFLD NASH. But I read somewhere where up to 60% of the test for ALT and AST can appear completely normal in a patient with NASH stage 4. So even then, kind of like what you did, even if some tests appear to be okay and they say, well, your bilirubin's okay, your ALT, AST is good, but you still think something's off if you're very lethargic and, all kinds of the different itchy skins and different things that just don't seem right. I think you're on the right track, Cheryl. You've got to keep insisting, do your own research and ask. And like I said, I go to the demand stage too.
Well, and I used to be that way with as far as the hemoglobin A1C test was too. I would talk to people constantly who said, well, my doctor just does a fasting blood sugar. And I'm like, no, you have to insist on having the A1C test. That's going to be your best measurement of what your blood sugar really is, because it measures 3 months of your blood glucose levels. You don't have to be fasting. And it's just a much more accurate test for really knowing. It's like, tell your doctor that's what you want. Don't just take what he says. It's like, I want this.
Oh, exactly.
And that's hard to do. It's hard to confront your doctor. For most people,
yeah, I agree.
I think that it is, because they look at the doctor, they're educated, they've been through all this, they know more than I do, so why should little old me demand something from the doctor? But as we keep saying, we are our best advocates.
And a patient knows their body better than anybody else.
Right.
And, doctors are human too. And so, they can miss something or whatever, but going through the experience with my mom, like I said, being misdiagnosed and the different problems, that's where I have gotten a lot more demanding that you have to, be assertive, because with a lot of the guidelines and the rules, things will get passed by if you don't say something. But, hopefully that whomever the doctor is, they're always going to do their best. But one thing to even add to that is I've actually talked to some nurse practitioners or physician assistants at some of the health fairs or just in different chat groups, support groups, that will say, oh, yeah, I've got fatty liver, but I was told to lose some weight. And they're actual medical professionals. So I don't think it's always that they're purposely not doing their due diligence and researching further, requiring more tests. I think there's a lot of medical professionals out there that really don't know. I'm sure with diabetes, the same thing. But I know with the NAFLD NASH, I've talked to several different people in the medical profession that really just think losing a few pounds, but it's no big deal. And when I tell them, do you understand that NASH can progress to cirrhosis and then, eventually liver cancer, they don't realize that it can have very deadly consequences if they don't lose the weight and do some things to hopefully modify their diet.
It's that way a lot with diabetes too. I talk to so many people who would say, yeah, well, it's normal for me to run in the 300s. Have you talked to your doctor about that? Is your doctor okay with that? Oh, my doctor's fine with it. Like, find a new doctor. That's not okay.
Yeah.
You can't do that. And when doctors go to medical school, they have a couple chapters on diabetes. I assume it's probably the same way about the liver. I mean, they're learning everything, right? And so they don't always get the practical, realistic education they need. They get this book, academic stuff about the disease, but not what it's like to live with it.
Exactly. Well, and I think, too, which I think that nephrology is under the same heading of like gut diseases, and sometimes a diabetes patient probably, do they ever end up at a gastroenterologist?
They might if they get, oh my gosh, my mind just went blank, gastroparesis.
Okay, because I know a lot of times in smaller hospitals, smaller rural communities, there's not a hepatologist. I know in Indiana, for example, since that's where we live, there's only one liver clinic. So a lot of the smaller patients, I'm sure around the country, they go to a gastroenterologist. That's,
right.
I call it
Kind
the
of
generalized gut doctor. So they have a general concept, but not necessarily an in-depth,
Right.
education and concentration on hepatology. And so I tell anybody, if you have any type of a liver disease or suspect any liver disease, or your primary care suspects you may have liver disease, you can get set up with a gastroenterologist if that's close to your house for the routine maintenance, but you always need to see a hepatologist, and I'm sure the same thing
Seek out
is
the expert
for the diabetes.
Right. And I don't, I just sitting here thinking, I probably just sound like I was bashing doctors, and I don't mean that in any way.
Oh, no.
I mean, they are there to help us and to, they can save our lives.
Exactly.
So I'm not bashing.
No.
I'm just saying that sometimes they don't always carry things far enough, and a person should never be afraid to change doctors if that's what they feel, or to seek second or third opinions.
Oh yeah, because kind of the joke, if you get 5 different doctors in a specialty in the same room, you're going to get 5 different opinions,
right.
And that is true. So part of it's the bedside manner that you're comfortable with, and then also, getting some different opinions and then taking a little bit of everything and I think weighing it out. Like I said, the onus is not just on the medical professional. It is on
right.
the patient, which
right.
is exactly what you're saying, to be your own advocate, to make sure you're doing your due diligence, doing your research.
Right.
Nowadays with, Google and Bing or whatever, browser you use, you can do your own. There's a lot of information available to the public. NIH is a great website.
Just make sure you're looking at credible websites, though, because there are those out there that are not credible, so you do need to be careful.
You go to like I said, NIH is always
right.
a good one. That will give you the
National
foundation.
Institutes for Health.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, that you can trust that.
Yeah, that's one of the go-tos. And like I said, I don't think either one of us would ever bash a doctor. Like I said, I went to school to become a surgical technologist. My dream was actually, the reason I did that is I wanted to get into surgery as a physician assistant. So I had open heart surgery when I was 3.5. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for a wonderful surgeon. So surgeons, scientists, researchers
right.
are all my heroes, but you have to help them by doing your own due diligence.
Right. Yeah, I worked for physicians for years, but sometimes you just have to point things out to them. Look how busy they are.
Exactly.
They're under a lot of pressure to see a lot of patients in a short amount of time, and sometimes you just need to try to reel them back in a little.
And I call it the connecting the dot issue too, because like with liver disease, with the NAFLD, like I said, my mom was misdiagnosed for so many years. She would get dry, itchy skin. She would have nosebleeds. She would have different things. And they would treat the symptom, but nobody was able to put it together to come up with her NAFLD NASH, then eventually cirrhosis diagnosis. And I think it's with any disease, but I think especially when it's a silent disease like diabetes and NASH, that if it's just the individual little symptoms,
right,
they don't connect the dots. And then getting one specialist to contact the other and sit down and discuss things, that's the other part of it too.
Yeah, it's very difficult. So you've got a lot on your plate, to get all this word out and to connect those dots for everyone.
Well, like I said, just trying, but at least I've been very fortunate. I've gotten to know a lot of people in the industry, and by volunteering with a lot of different groups, gotten to know a lot of people and talked with a lot of different patients. And with my podcast and my show series, I'm hoping to have physicians on, researchers, patients, family members, caregivers, and get a different perspective, some scientific, factual, and then just some of the hurdles, the everyday little things that people don't think about that the families go through or the patient goes through.
And that's so important because it makes the patients realize, I'm not crazy.
Yeah.
Other people have gone through this too, and it's a real thing, and it's so, they understand that they're okay.
Yeah, the best thing I've ever done is when I've post my mother's death was joining the NASH support groups, the hepatic encephalopathy support groups, the dialysis support group, et cetera, because I realize it makes me actually very sad because I realize how much sometimes my mom suffered that I had no idea, or the light bulb goes off and I think, oh my gosh, if I had just seen that and put it together. So that's my purpose of this show, is to help other people's light bulbs go off before it's too late.
Right. That's fantastic.
Well, thank you. And I can't thank you enough for coming on the show and helping me spread the word and give your input as a former ADA director and as a diabetes patient yourself, because you've lived the life yourself.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I know the difficulties, and I know the questions to talk to my doctor about. So we got to get everybody to know those questions.
Well, hopefully this will help a little bit.
Yeah.
And on that note, I would like to thank Joliffe Digital Productions for hosting this wonderful live feed and podcast. And also the graphic back here was done for me by Pictures to Digital. John normally does photo restorations, editing, and videotape conversion, but as a favor, he did this lovely graphic for my first show here, and I'm very thankful for that as well. At this point, unless you can think of anything else.
I don't think so.
Well, again, I just can't thank you enough, Carol, for being on the show.
It's my pleasure to help you.
Well, thank you. And to begin with, we're going to be doing probably one show a month, and hopefully we can ramp it up where I have enough guests lined up to do one show a week. And so the next show will be sometime in January. And I'm looking at probably bringing on a patient at that point, or a former patient, to discuss some of the things they dealt with their NAFLD NASH. Since I can only give the caregiver side of it, somebody that's actually, been in the trenches and dealt with the issues themselves as a patient. So
that when you just said the word caregiver, it just brought up something else to me, and that caregivers often become ill themselves while they're caregiving because they don't take any time for themselves. They eat wrong because they're just trying to stuff some meals down because they know they need to eat, but they're not really eating the right things. They may not get enough sleep. And so it's important for caregivers to also seek support among other caregivers, not just for the patients with the disease, but the caregiver also needs to find support and help take care of themselves.
I will nod my head, but I've never done it myself. but yeah, I know you're supposed to definitely.
Some of the programs that we used to do, we would have sessions for caregivers so that they could talk to other people and find ways to help them cope, because it's difficult.
Well, one of the things I'm also working on trying to do is get for Indiana, since it's obviously a geographic issue, a face-to-face support group going for NAFLD NASH patients. But I want to include some patients, caregivers, and family members where people can share experiences, have some educational moments, like having a nutritionist in or a physical therapist in to work with the exercise, having a doctor in, but also just so, as you're saying, that the caregivers can talk about some of the things they go, maybe have some breakout sessions where caregivers can talk and family members can talk, because it's disease, whether it's diabetes or NAFLD or the combination of the two, because often the NAFLD patient has diabetes and vice versa. There's so many different aspects and different ways that people and everybody around them are affected. So
caregivers also need to take care of themselves.
And hopefully by this podcast, people will realize that there's people out there trying to educate, that are going through the same things, and that they're not alone. That's, the big thing. And hopefully, I have a Facebook page, Cheryl's Legacy, team page, Liver Patient Advocacy. You can always contact me through there if you have any questions, or I can maybe help connect you to a different group. I do that. Like I said, that's just my own little page. It's not sponsored by any specific group or anything. It's just my effort. Just like this podcast is strictly my effort. It's not a sponsored group. I'm not an organization or anything like that. Just sad, grieving daughter. And when people say, well, thank you for doing this, Nancy, I always say, you know what, it's very easy to do out of love and loss, because I would do anything in this world to have my mom back. So it's easy when I can do it for my mom's honor and her legacy, that no one else loses what we did. So,
and besides Facebook, also your LinkedIn, because you post excellent information on LinkedIn.
I try and, like I said, I'm not a professional expert. My surgical technology background certainly doesn't qualify me for any kind of a medical professional, but I do a lot of research, and I'm connected with a lot of people in the industry, and I try and at least post the information that other people can read and research. I'm actually under Nancy G. Paul on both LinkedIn and then Facebook, but it's the Cheryl's Legacy page that I use with Facebook. So, if anybody watching has any questions, wants, concern or issue, is interested in being in a support group with me in Indiana, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll do my best to respond as quickly as I can. All right. Well, thank you so much. And again, thank you, Joel of Productions. Wonderful job tonight.